Imagine the room growing quiet, the lamp low, the world outside softening into a dark blue hush, and then let your mind drift far south and far back, to a river that did not need clocks to keep time, because the Nile had its own breathing, its own rising and falling, its own patient command over the lives of everyone who lived beside it. Every year the waters came with silt, reeds, fish, mud, and promise. Every year they withdrew and left the black soil shining beneath the sun. And from that dependable miracle, a civilization learned to dream in stone, to count the seasons, to honor the dead, to obey the gods, and to place one living man at the center of heaven and earth. The pharaoh was not only a ruler, not only a war leader, not only the owner of palaces and granaries and boats with painted sails, he was the balance of the land made visible, the keeper of Mayat, the sacred order that held back chaos. He stood between the people and the gods like a column between roof and floor. And, in the long story of ancient Egypt, some pharaohs rose like the morning sun over the desert cliffs, while others faded like gold leaf rubbed by too many hands. Their names remain with us because their ambitions were carved deeper than ordinary memory, on temple walls, on pyramid passages, on statues so calm they seem to have fallen asleep while waiting for eternity. This is a story of the greatest among them, not only because they won battles or built monuments, but because each one changed the meaning of kingship. Each one added a layer to the long dream of Egypt. And each one, in time, was forced to face the quiet law that comes for every empire, the law of decline, uncertainty, and forgetting. Before there were pyramids, before the Valley of the Kings, before the golden mask of a boy king or the colossal seated figures of Ramesses, there were scattered communities along the Nile, villages of farmers, hunters, boatmen, potters, priests, and chiefs, learning to live with flood and drought, learning to store grain, learning to mark difference in burial and ornament. Then slowly, like dawn spreading along water, two Egypts came into view. Upper Egypt in the south, a narrow valley held between cliffs, and Lower Egypt in the north, a rich delta opening like a green fan toward the Mediterranean. Their symbols were different. Their crowns were different. Their local powers were different. But the river tied them together, carrying boats, goods, news, songs, and soldiers, until a king remembered by later tradition as Menes, and often linked with Narmer, became the figure of union, the man who joined the two lands into one kingdom. The Narmer palette shows a king larger than all others, wearing crowns, striking enemies, walking in ceremony, watched by divine signs. And although we cannot step fully into that moment, we can feel its meaning. Egypt was no longer only a river country. It had become a royal idea, a land that imagined itself as one body. With the pharaoh as its heart, the earliest pharaohs ruled from a world still close to mud brick, reed, and ritual. Yet already they understood the power of images, seals, tombs, processions, and names. They built at Abydos and Saqqara. They sent officials to collect tribute. They shaped a court where writing became an instrument of command. And they established the pattern that later kings would magnify into grandeur. The pharaoh had to appear timeless, but he lived inside fragile human arrangements. He needed administrators who could measure fields after the flood, priests who could speak for temples, craftsmen who could produce luxury from stone, wood, gold, copper, faience, and linen, soldiers who could guard borders, and farmers whose labor supported everything. The rise of Egypt's first great dynasties was therefore not only the rise of kings, it was the rise of organization, patience, and memory, a society learning how to preserve itself in records and rituals. In those early centuries, the tomb became a second palace. Because death was not imagined as disappearance, it was a journey that required food, servants, sacred words, and a body protected from decay. The king's tomb grew more important because the king's afterlife mattered to the entire country. If he lived forever with the gods, Egypt's order could continue if his name endured, His authority could remain active in the invisible world. Out of that belief came one of the most astonishing transformations in human history. The royal tomb changed from a pit in the earth into a monument rising toward the sky. And the pharaoh who stands at the beginning of that transformation is Djoser, ruler of the Third Dynasty, remembered through his vast funerary complex at Saqqara. Djoser's name is inseparable from Imhotep, the brilliant official later honored as architect, healer, sage, and almost divine figure. Together they gave Egypt a new way to speak in stone, where earlier tombs were rectangular mastabas, low and heavy like benches of eternity. Djoser's monument stacked that form upward into the step pyramid, rising tier by tier from the desert. Not smooth yet, not the perfect triangle that later generations would attempt, but more daring than anything before it. Around it stood courtyards, shrines, walls, false doors, columns shaped like bundled reeds, stone imitating perishable materials as though the entire older world had been made permanent. It was a rehearsal for eternity, a place where the dead king could continue his festival rites and renew his strength forever. And as night falls in the imagination over Saqqara, you can almost see the pale steps catching moonlight, the desert silent, the black land beyond breathing softly under stars. While Egypt learns that kingship can be built high enough to touch the heavens, after Djoser came generations of experiment, adjustment, ambition, and failure, because even the most eternal monuments begin as human attempts. There were pyramids that leaned toward collapse, pyramids whose angles changed halfway upward, pyramids that taught builders what stone would allow and what it would punish. Then came Sneferu, founder of the Fourth Dynasty, a pharaoh whose reputation was so bright that later Egyptians remembered him as a good king, generous, approachable, almost gentle in royal memory. Yet the scale of his building reveals a ruler of tremendous command. Sneferu was not satisfied with one monument. He built at Meidum, at Djoser, and perhaps elsewhere, and through his reign, the pyramid became perfected. The bent pyramid at Djoser still seems to hold the story of experiment within its body, rising steeply from the desert before changing angle near the top, as if the stone itself had advised caution. Nearby, the red pyramid achieves the smooth true form that later became the classic royal mountain. Wide-based, serene, immense, its reddish stone glowing warmly under the low sun. Sneferu's age was one of confidence. Trade, mining expeditions, cedar from Lebanon, turquoise and copper from Sinai, cattle counts, royal estates, and a court wealthy enough to mobilize thousands of workers in seasonal rhythm. We often imagine pyramid builders as anonymous crowds swallowed by sand, but they were part of an organized national effort, fed, housed, directed, rotated, and remembered in traces of settlement and graffiti. Their labor was hard, but it was woven into the religious and political life of the state. For the pharaoh's tomb was not merely his private vanity. It was the central project of a civilization that believed stability could be made visible. Sneferu's rise prepared the way for the most famous builder of them all, Khufu, the king whom the Greeks later called Cheops, ruler behind the Great Pyramid of Giza, the largest and most exacting monument of Old Kingdom Egypt. Khufu himself is elusive, almost ghost-like beside the monument that bears his memory. A tiny ivory statuette is often associated with him, small enough to sit in the hand, while his pyramid overwhelms the horizon. This contrast feels like a whispered lesson from history. The body of the king vanished into fragility, while the idea of the king became stone. The Great Pyramid was not only a tomb, it was a statement of cosmic order, aligned with careful precision, filled with chambers, passages, relieving spaces, blocked corridors, and mysteries that still invite wonder. Around it stood boat pits, satellite pyramids, mastabas of officials and queens, causeways and temples. An entire sacred landscape where royal death was managed as carefully as royal life. Khufu's reign shows Egypt at a summit of administrative power, able to quarry limestone, transport granite from Aswan, feed a massive workforce, and coordinate labor across years. And yet, even at this height, there is a softness when we imagine evening falling over the Giza plateau, dust settling after the day's work, men returning to bread, beer, onions, fish, songs, aches, laughter, and sleep, while the pyramid, still incomplete, rises above them like a second horizon. Khufu's successors inherited not only a throne, but an expectation of greatness. His son Khafra built the second Great Pyramid at Giza, set on higher ground so that from certain angles it seems almost to rival or surpass his father's monument. And he is often linked with the Great Sphinx, that mysterious lion-bodied guardian with a human head gazing eastward across the plateau. Though the details remain debated, the Sphinx has become one of the most powerful images of pharaonic kingship. Strength joined to watchfulness, animal force joined to human intelligence, a royal face weathered by wind, sand, and centuries of devotion. Khafra's Valley Temple, with its massive limestone and granite blocks, suggests an architecture of weight, silence, and ritual control. The statues found there show him enthroned, calm, protected by the falcon god Horus, the king's body idealized beyond ordinary age, his gaze focused beyond the viewer, beyond the present, beyond the smallness of life. Then came Menkore, builder of the third Great Pyramid at Giza, smaller than the others but refined, accompanied by beautiful triad statues in which the king stands with goddesses and regional personifications. His reign is remembered by later tradition in gentler tones, and his monument reminds us that greatness in Egypt was not always measured only by size. Sometimes it was measured by balance, proportion, polish, and the ability to place the human form inside divine harmony. After the Fourth Dynasty, the Pyramid Age did not vanish at once, but its scale changed. The kings of the Fifth Dynasty built smaller pyramids and increasingly devoted energy to sun temples, showing the growing importance of the solar cult of Ra. The pharaoh was no longer only the Horus king, he was also son of Ra, child of the sun. And with each morning sunrise, his authority renewed itself in golden light. Kings such as Userkaf, Sahure, Neferirkare, and Unas reveal a court more complex, a religious world more elaborated, and an administration spreading power among elite families. In Unas's pyramid appear the pyramid texts, sacred spells carved on walls to help the dead king ascend, transform, join the gods, and travel among stars. These writings are among the oldest large bodies of religious literature in the world, and they carry a strange, quiet beauty. The king becomes a falcon, a flame, a star that cannot perish, a being who climbs the ladder of heaven and eats among the gods. But while the texts promised immortality, the earthly institution of kingship began to change. Officials became powerful in provinces. Tombs outside the royal center grew richer. Local governors strengthened their families, and the king's monopoly over the afterlife slowly loosened. More people sought sacred texts, finer burials, and names that could survive. It was not collapse yet, it was diffusion, like water leaving one channel for many smaller streams. The Old Kingdom's long afternoon came under the Sixth Dynasty, and among its rulers stands Pepi II, often remembered for an extraordinarily long reign. Though the exact length remains uncertain, later tradition imagined him ruling from childhood into deep old age. And whether every detail is precise or not, his name became associated with a kingdom that lasted too long under weakening conditions. There is something almost dreamlike in the image of an aged pharaoh sitting in a palace while the world around him changes. The central authority thinning, the provinces growing louder, the old pyramid machinery becoming harder to sustain. The Nile perhaps failing in some years, harvests tightening, and officials no longer looking to Memphis with the same unquestioned obedience. Tomb biographies from the period speak of local leaders feeding their districts, protecting their people, taking pride in regional service, and that pride tells us something important. When the center could not provide, The provinces became centers of meaning. The pharaoh's fall was not a single dramatic crash. No one day when the crown slipped from his head and Egypt ended. It was more like the slow dimming of a lamp, the gradual realization that old formulas no longer carried enough force. After Pepi II, royal names become obscure, brief, uncertain, and Egypt entered what historians call the First Intermediate Period, a time of divided power, local rulers, competing dynasties, and social stress. Later literature remembered it as an age when order was overturned. When the poor became rich, the rich suffered. Tombs were violated, and the river of justice ran backward. These texts may exaggerate, shaped by memory and royal propaganda, but they preserve the feeling of a world anxious about disorder. For a civilization devoted to Mayat, fragmentation was more than politics. It was a spiritual wound still. Egypt did not disappear. Farmers farmed, scribes wrote, artisans worked, priests served temples, mothers fed children, boats moved on the Nile, and local courts developed their own culture. The old unity had fractured, but life continued in smaller circles. Then from the south at Thebes, a new force began to rise. A line of rulers who would challenge the northern powers and reunify the country. The most important among them was Mentuhotep II, founder in effect of the Middle Kingdom's restored order. His victory was not merely military, it was symbolic. The two lands were joined again, and Thebes, once a regional power, became a sacred royal city with new importance. Mentuhotep's mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahri stood against the western cliffs, blending terraces, temple, tomb, and mountain in a form unlike the great pyramids of Giza, more intimate with the landscape, more connected to the Theban West, where the sun died each evening and the dead entered hidden realms. Mentuhotep II's reign offered Egypt a second beginning, and the Middle Kingdom that followed is often called a classical age, not because it merely repeated the Old Kingdom, but because it balanced royal authority with literary refinement, administrative skill, frontier policy, and a deeper awareness of human vulnerability. The pharaohs of the 11th and 12th dynasties did not command the same pyramid scale as Khufu, yet they created a government of impressive reach. They reclaimed lands, built fortresses, sponsored temples, developed irrigation in the Fayum, and left stories that still feel psychologically alive. Kingship in this period seems more thoughtful, more burdened, more conscious of danger. In texts such as the Instruction for Merikare, the Prophecy of Neferti, and the Tale of Sinuhe, we hear a society reflecting on loyalty, exile, justice, fear, and the loneliness of power. Among the great Middle Kingdom rulers stands Senusret III, a pharaoh whose statues are some of the most striking in all Egyptian art. Unlike the smooth, youthful faces of many earlier kings, Senusret III appears with heavy eyelids, deep lines, a stern mouth, and an expression that seems almost tired, not weak, but awake to responsibility. He looks like a ruler who has seen the cost of rule. His reign was marked by military campaigns into Nubia, the building of powerful fortresses along the Nile, and administrative reforms that strengthened royal control. Nubia mattered deeply to Egypt because it held gold, trade routes, soldiers, cattle, and strategic depth. The forts at places such as Buhin and Semna were not mere outposts. They were statements of surveillance and command. Where Egyptian power watched the river and regulated movement, Senusret III's boundary inscriptions speak with uncompromising authority, warning successors not to abandon what he had secured. And yet beneath the hard language lies a familiar imperial truth. Borders must be guarded because they are never final. Another major ruler, Amenemhat III, turned attention toward prosperity, building, mining, and the Fayum region, where canals and water management helped extend agricultural wealth. His long reign shines with bureaucratic confidence, but again, the great pattern returns. Strength creates complexity. Complexity requires maintenance, and maintenance depends on people, climate, succession, and luck. After the Middle Kingdom's height, royal power weakened, dynasties multiplied, foreign groups settled in the Delta, and eventually Egypt entered another divided age, the Second Intermediate Period. This time, the challenge came not only from internal fragmentation, but from rulers known as the Hyksos, whose power centered in the eastern delta at Avaris. They were of Western Asian origin, and they adopted many Egyptian customs while also bringing new military technologies and connections, including horse-drawn chariots that would change warfare. Later, Egyptian memory painted them as invaders and violators, but the reality was likely more gradual and mixed, a story of migration, settlement, trade, power, and conflict still to Theban rulers in the south. Hyksos kings in the Delta represented an unacceptable division of the sacred land. The struggle against the Hyksos became one of the great turning points in Egyptian history, because from it emerged not simply another reunification, but an empire, Sekenenre Tau, Kamose, and finally Ahmose. I led the Theban resistance, and their story carries the energy of a dark house beginning to fill with fire. Sekenenre's mummy, with violent wounds to the head, suggests a king who met brutality, perhaps in battle or execution. Kamose pushed north and left inscriptions full of fierce royal language, refusing to accept foreign rule in Egypt's heartlands. But it was Ahmose who completed the expulsion of the Hyksos from Avaris and pursued them into southern Palestine, founding the 18th dynasty and opening the New Kingdom. Egypt's most imperial age, Ahmose did not only restore what had been lost, he transformed the memory of humiliation into a new policy of expansion. The lesson Egypt drew from foreign rule was clear. Security could not stop at the Delta. Enemies must be kept far away, beyond deserts, beyond forts, beyond vassal cities. Beyond the old edges of the map, the New Kingdom pharaoh became warrior, builder, temple patron, diplomat, and divine conqueror. And the land that had once focused so deeply inward now projected power into Nubia and the Levant. Ahmose's reign also raised the importance of Thebes and its god Amun, whose priesthood would grow wealthy and influential. The god who had helped deliver victory now received temples, offerings, lands, and prestige. And in that alliance between king and god lay both glory and future tension. After Ahmose came Amenhotep I, then Thutmose I, rulers who carried Egyptian armies farther, building the empire's reach. Thutmose I campaigned deep into Nubia and into Western Asia, leaving the image of Egypt as a force that could strike beyond familiar horizons. But the New Kingdom was not only iron and chariots, it was also ceremony, gold, carved relief, incense, diplomacy, and theological splendor. The king's tomb changed too, no longer rising as a visible pyramid on open desert, but hidden in the Valley of the Kings, cut into the Theban cliffs, where secrecy replaced display. While the mortuary temple stood apart in the cultivated edge of the West, there is something deeply fitting about this shift. The Old Kingdom king ascended under a mountain of stone. The New Kingdom king entered the hidden earth like the setting sun, moving through painted corridors into the night journey of the afterlife, guarded by spells, serpents, gods, stars, and doors that opened only to sacred knowledge. Among all the rulers of the New Kingdom, few are as fascinating as Hatshepsut, the woman who became king, daughter of Thutmose I, wife of Thutmose II, and regent for the young Thutmose III. She rose within the conventions of royal legitimacy and then stepped beyond them, adopting full pharaonic titles, royal regalia, and a public image that presented her not as queen ruling beside a king, but as king herself, chosen by Amun, born of divine intention and rightful holder of the throne. Hatshepsut understood that kingship was made from ritual, architecture, ancestry, and story, and she mastered all four. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri remains one of the most graceful monuments in Egypt. Terraces rising from the desert floor toward the cliffs, colonnades arranged with calm elegance, ramps leading the eye upward, the whole structure seeming to grow from the mountain rather than defy it. Its walls told of divine birth, royal offering, and the famous expedition to Punt, a distant land associated with incense trees, exotic goods, myrrh, ebony, ivory, animals, and wonder. This was not conquest in the usual masculine vocabulary of smiting enemies. It was abundance brought home through royal command, proof that under Hatshepsut, the world yielded fragrance and wealth to Egypt. Her reign appears prosperous, artistic, and stable, though later attempts were made to erase or obscure her memory, especially by removing her names and images in some places. The reasons remain debated, perhaps politics of succession, perhaps discomfort with a female king, perhaps the need of later rulers to simplify legitimacy. But the erasure was not complete. Stone remembered what chisels tried to silence, and modern discovery brought her back into the story. Hatshepsut's rise asks us to imagine power as performance, not false performance, but sacred theater so effective that it becomes political reality. When she appears with false beard and Neem's headdress, she is not pretending in a simple sense. She is entering the ancient grammar of kingship, wearing the symbols that made the office recognizable to gods and people. After her came Thutmose III, long overshadowed in youth, but later one of Egypt's greatest warrior pharaohs. If Hatshepsut's reign was the careful flowering of legitimacy, Thutmose III's sole rule became a storm of campaigns. He led armies into the Levant, most famously at Megiddo, where a coalition of Canaanite princes gathered against Egyptian control. The annals carved at Karnak describe the campaign with rare detail. The king choosing a dangerous narrow route, surprising enemies, besieging the city, and asserting dominance. Whether every royal claim is exact or heightened by propaganda, Thutmose III clearly created an empire of remarkable reach, with tribute, hostages, vassal rulers, garrisons, and diplomatic webs stretching across Western Asia. Thutmose III's empire brought Egypt wealth beyond imagination: gold from Nubia, timber, horses, chariots, silver, lapis, fine vessels, foreign servants, exotic animals, and the prestige of distant rulers sending gifts that Egyptian texts often described as tribute. The pharaoh became not merely lord of the Nile, but a player in an international age, connected with Mitanni, Babylonia, Assyria, Hatti, Cyprus, and the city-states of the Levant. Yet empire always contains a quiet danger. The farther power extends, the more it must negotiate. Police, threaten, reward, and remember. The pharaoh cannot personally stand at every border, so loyalty must be arranged through officials. Marriages, hostages, letters, and fear. Thutmose III's greatness lay in converting victory into structure. He reorganized, recorded, built, and offered the wealth of conquest to Amun, especially at Karnak, where temples expanded into a vast sacred complex. The god's estate grew rich, and the king's victories became divine property. After him, Amenhotep II and Thutmose IV maintained imperial prestige, though often through inherited systems, and then came Amenhotep III, a pharaoh whose reign glows like late afternoon gold. Less a storm of battle than a festival of abundance, Egypt under Amenhotep III was wealthy, cosmopolitan, confident, and artistically brilliant. The king married the formidable Queen Tia, whose prominence in art and diplomacy suggests unusual influence. He built on a magnificent scale, from temples in Nubia to the great mortuary temple on the west bank of Thebes, now mostly vanished except for the colossal seated statues known as the Colossi of Memnon, which still face the sunrise across the fields. He celebrated jubilees, commissioned statues, scarabs, palaces, and luxury objects, and presented himself as radiant, solar, almost divine while alive. Foreign correspondence from the Amarna letters shows the world of diplomacy, in which kings called each other brother while bargaining over gold, brides, gifts, and prestige. Amenhotep III's Egypt was so rich that other rulers asked for gold, as if Egypt's mountains produced it like dust. But the splendor had a shadow when the royal image grows too dazzling. The structures behind it can become delicate. The priesthood of Amun was powerful. Court factions mattered. Foreign vassals required attention, and the theology of kingship was shifting toward more intense solar expression. Amenhotep III's reign feels like the last calm evening before a strange dream. For his successor, Amenhotep IV, would become Akhenaten, and with him Egypt would experience one of the most unusual religious and political experiments in ancient history. Akhenaten began within the familiar world of Thebes, but soon he turned with startling intensity toward the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, not merely as one god among many, but as the supreme focus of worship. He changed his name from Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, and founded a new royal city at Akhenaten, now called Amarna, on a desert bay of cliffs in Middle Egypt, a place he described as chosen by the Aten, unclaimed by other gods. There he built open-air temples flooded with sunlight, palaces with painted floors, administrative quarters, workshops, houses, tombs, and boundary stelae that announced his vision. Art changed dramatically. Royal bodies became elongated, intimate, unusual, sometimes tender, sometimes unsettling. Akhenaten, Queen Nefertiti, and their daughters appear beneath the Aten's rays, each ray ending in tiny hands offering life. The royal family became the central channel through which divine blessing reached the world. This was not simply private devotion. It was a reordering of power, because to elevate the Aten was also to diminish Amun's priesthood and the old temple networks. The full nature of Akhenaten's religion remains debated, but its political effect was unmistakable. It unsettled centuries of balance. Some see in him a visionary, some a fanatic, some a poet-king, some a ruler whose inward obsession weakened imperial oversight. The truth may contain pieces of all these portraits. His great hymn to the Aten praises sunlight as the source of life for humans, animals, plants, foreign lands, and Egypt alike, an expansive and beautiful vision. Yet beauty in theology does not guarantee stability in government. Letters from vassals in the Levant suggest anxiety, pleas for help, rivalries, and threats, though we must read them carefully as diplomatic documents shaped by self-interest. Still, the impression is of an empire no longer managed with the same attention. At home, traditional cults suffered. Names of Amun were attacked, and the new city depended heavily on the king's presence. When Akhenaten died, his revolution quickly unraveled. Because it had not rooted itself deeply enough in the broader structure of Egyptian life, a civilization that had spent over 1,000 years multiplying gods, festivals, temples, and local identities could not easily be narrowed to one blazing disk controlled by one royal family. The fall of Akhenaten's vision was swift, but the memory of it would trouble later generations, who treated him and his successors as illegitimate or embarrassing, a wound in the royal line to be covered over. After the glare of Amarna came the fragile reign of Tutankhamun, the boy king whose modern fame far exceeds his ancient power. He came to the throne as Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, and later became Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, a name change that tells the story of restoration in miniature. Under the guidance of powerful advisors such as A and Horemheb, the court abandoned Akhenaten, returned to older religious patterns, repaired temples, restored priesthoods, and tried to stitch Egypt's sacred order back together. Tutankhamun was young, perhaps around 9 when he became king, and still a teenager when he died. His reign was short, his political agency limited, his monuments often modest or later usurped. Yet his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, discovered nearly intact in the 20th century, gave the world an intimate vision of royal burial that no robbed pyramid could provide. Golden shrines nested like sacred boxes, chariots, beds shaped like animals, alabaster vessels, jewelry, weapons, walking sticks, games, food, clothing, and the famous mask with calm blue and gold face. These objects were not simply treasures. They were equipment for eternity, carefully arranged for a young king entering the dangerous night of the afterlife. The tomb was small compared with those of greater rulers, perhaps prepared quickly after unexpected death. And that may be why it survived, hidden beneath later debris, overlooked by ancient robbers after limited intrusion, waiting in darkness while empires rose and fell above it. Tutankhamun's greatness is therefore paradoxical. He was not the greatest pharaoh in life, but in death he became the most recognizable. His burial allowed modern people to feel the texture of pharaonic hope, the weight of gold, the scent of resins imagined in sealed chambers, the silence of a royal body surrounded by objects chosen with care. After him, A ruled briefly. Then Horemheb, a military man and restorer who tried to erase the Amarna line and present himself as the legitimate heir of stability. Horemheb reorganized administration, punished corruption in decrees, and prepared the ground for a new dynasty, because the 18th dynasty, for all its glory, had ended in crisis. The empire still stood, the temples still functioned, the Nile still rose, but legitimacy had been bruised, and Egypt needed rulers who could claim discipline, military competence, and orthodox devotion. From that need emerged the 19th dynasty, beginning with Ramesses II, a short reigning founder, and then Seti III, one of the most impressive kings of the New Kingdom. Seti I restored grandeur with a seriousness that can still be felt in stone. His reliefs are among the finest in Egyptian art, carved with elegance, precision, and quiet force. At Abydos, he built a beautiful temple honoring Osiris and the royal ancestors, including a king list that carefully omitted the Amarna rulers. As though official memory could be purified by selective naming, Seti campaigned in the Levant, fought Libyans, secured routes, and strengthened Egypt's imperial position. He presented himself as warrior and restorer, a king putting the world back into proper shape after disorder. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings is one of the most magnificent, with long painted corridors, astronomical ceilings, and sacred books of the underworld unfolding across walls. A royal journey through night written in color and line. Then came his son Ramesses II, perhaps the most celebrated pharaoh of them all, known as Ramesses the Great, a ruler whose reign lasted over 6 decades and whose monuments spread across Egypt and Nubia with extraordinary confidence. Ramesses understood visibility. He placed his name everywhere, carved his image colossal, completed and expanded temples, built a new capital in the eastern delta called Pi-Ramesses, and turned his own life into a long performance of divine kingship. Early in his reign, he faced the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, one of the most famous military encounters of the ancient world. Egyptian inscriptions describe Ramesses as isolated, surrounded, calling on Amun, and personally turning disaster into triumph, while Hittite records and modern analysis suggest a more complex and less decisive outcome, perhaps a tactical escape rather than a clear victory. Yet Ramesses transformed Kadesh into royal legend, carving versions of the battle on temple walls from Abydos to Luxor to Abu Simbel. The lesson is important. Pharaohs did not only make history, they edited it, arranged it, enlarged it, and offered it to gods and people as truth shaped by purpose. Later, Ramesses and the Hittites made one of the earliest known peace treaties between great powers, sealed by diplomacy and marriage, and this may be more meaningful than the battle itself. For a long-reigning king must learn not only how to fight, but how to preserve prestige when endless war becomes costly. Ramesses built Abu Simbel in Nubia, where 4 seated colossi of the king gaze outward with serene authority. And inside, sunlight reaches the sanctuary on special days, touching divine figures in a drama of stone, astronomy, and royal presence. Nearby, the smaller temple honors Queen Nefertari, beloved royal wife, whose beauty and status were celebrated in art and inscription. Ramesses II's Egypt was magnificent, but magnificence can hide strain. The longer he lived, the more sons, officials, estates, and expectations accumulated around him. Many heirs died before him. And when he finally passed into the afterlife, the throne went to Merneptah, already an older man, who inherited not the freshness of empire, but the burden of preserving a huge legacy. Merneptah faced threats from Libyans and groups associated with the Sea Peoples, and his victory inscription contains the earliest widely recognized mention of Israel, placing Egypt within the shifting world of the Late Bronze Age. His reign shows that the Eastern Mediterranean was becoming unstable, old powers under pressure, trade networks vulnerable, migrations and raids intensifying, palaces and kingdoms beyond Egypt beginning to tremble. After Merneptah, succession troubles weakened the 19th dynasty. Brief reigns, rival claims, and internal conflict disturbed the line. And eventually a new restoration came under Setnakta and his son Ramesses III of the 20th dynasty. Ramesses III is often called the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, and his reign feels like a final strong wall against a rising storm. He fought Libyan invaders, battled sea peoples who came by land and sea, and recorded his victories at Medinet Habu, where reliefs show ships, soldiers, captives, ox carts, families, weapons, and the organized violence of a world in motion. The inscriptions present Ramesses III as savior, the king who crushed chaos before it swallowed Egypt. And perhaps he did preserve the country from the fate that befell other Bronze Age states. But victory did not restore the old age of effortless wealth. Egypt survived, yet survival is not the same as renewal. The costs were heavy, resources strained. Royal tomb workers at Deir el-Medina went on strike during his reign because rations were delayed. One of the first recorded labor strikes in history, a small but powerful sign that the machinery of the state was faltering. Even the king's palace was not safe. A harem conspiracy sought his death and to place another prince on the throne. Judicial papyri record trials and punishments, and modern examination of Ramesses III's mummy suggests his throat was cut, a chillingly human end for a ruler whose temple walls declared cosmic victory. With him, the new kingdom's grandeur did not vanish immediately, but its strongest pulse weakened. Later, Ramesside kings bore famous names, but commanded diminishing authority. Tomb robberies increased, priests gained power, officials struggled with corruption, and the wealth of empire ebbed. The fall of Egypt's greatest pharaohs was never only the failure of individuals, it was the slow transformation of the world around them. The new kingdom had depended on control of Nubian gold, influence in the Levant, temple wealth, agricultural productivity, and a royal ideology powerful enough to make obedience feel sacred. But the late 2nd millennium BCE brought pressures that no pharaoh could fully master. Climate stress may have affected harvests across regions. Trade routes broke, foreign powers shifted, iron technologies spread, mobile groups moved through collapsing systems, and internal institutions in Egypt grew too strong or too divided for the crown to dominate easily. In Thebes, the high priests of Amun became almost kingly, controlling wealth, land, and ritual authority, while in the north military and administrative families held power. By the end of the 20th dynasty, Egypt entered the third intermediate period, a long age of divided rule, where kings in Tanis, high priests in Thebes, Libyan chiefs, local dynasts, and later Nubian rulers all shared or contested authority. Yet even in division, Egypt remained culturally powerful. Temples continued, art adapted, priests copied sacred texts, and the pharaoh's image survived even when political reality had changed. Libyan origin rulers of the 22nd dynasty, including Sheshonq, took Egyptian titles and built in Egyptian ways, showing that conquest or migration into Egypt often resulted not in cultural replacement, but in adoption of pharaonic forms. Sheshonq campaigned in the Levant and left records at Karnak, but his dynasty's control fragmented over time. Then from the south came one of the most remarkable reversals in the ancient story. Nubia, long conquered and influenced by Egypt, gave rise to the kingdom of Kush, whose rulers at Napata embraced Amun, pyramids, hieroglyphic traditions, and the sacred language of Egyptian kingship. Pa, a Kushite king, marched north and conquered Egypt, presenting himself not as a foreign destroyer, but as a restorer of proper worship and order. His victory, Stela reveals a ruler deeply committed to Egyptian religious ideals, offended by impurity, proud of his devotion to Amun, and careful to frame conquest as moral correction. The 25th dynasty, the Kushite pharaohs, including Pa, Shabaka, Shebitku, Taharka, and Tutankhamun, ruled an Egypt that was both ancient and renewed, African in a broader Nile sense, deeply tied to Nubia, and engaged with the rising power of Assyria in the Near East. Taharka in particular built widely and appears in biblical and Assyrian contexts, a pharaoh of international significance, yet the Assyrian Empire was a formidable force, and its invasions eventually drove the Kushites from Egypt, ending their rule in the north while their kingdom continued in Nubia. After the Kushites came the Sate revival of the 26th dynasty, centered in the delta city of Sais, with rulers such as Psamtik Pamphrons, Necho II, Psamtik II, and Amasis. This period feels like an autumn renaissance, a time when Egypt looked back lovingly to older styles, revived ancient artistic forms, hired Greek mercenaries, expanded trade, engaged with Mediterranean powers, and tried to stand among empires that had become larger and more aggressive than the world Egypt once dominated. Psamtik I reunited Egypt after Assyrian involvement and built a new base of power through diplomacy, soldiers, and careful administration. Necho II pursued ambitious projects, including naval activity and perhaps work connected with canal routes. And he involved Egypt in the politics of the Near East, as Babylon rose after Assyria's fall. Amasis ruled during a period of prosperity and Greek connection, allowing foreign trade at Naucratis and balancing tradition with openness. Yet Egypt was no longer protected by the old distance of desert and sea. The Near East had become a world of vast imperial machines, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, and later Macedonian, each able to move armies across enormous territories. In 525 BCE, Cambyses the Tadintides, Sadusekus of Persia, conquered Egypt. Making it part of the Achaemenid Empire, the pharaoh's crown could now be worn by a foreign great king whose main power lay far beyond the Nile. Egyptians rebelled at times, native dynasties briefly returned, and rulers such as Nectanebo-Thrarn and Nectanebo II tried to revive temple building and independence. Nectanebo II, the last native pharaoh of ancient Egypt, stands at the edge of a long closing door. He built, he honored gods, he resisted Persia. But he could not permanently preserve the old sovereignty. When the Persians returned, he fled, and with him ended the line of native Egyptian kings that had begun in the mist of early dynasties. There is a sadness in that ending. Not because Egyptian culture died, it did not, but because the sacred idea of a pharaoh born from the land itself, crowned through its own deep continuity, had been broken. After Persia came Alexander the Great, welcomed in Egypt and crowned as pharaoh, founder of Alexandria, visitor to the oracle of Amun at Siwa, a Macedonian conqueror who understood the value of Egyptian legitimacy. After him, the Ptolemies ruled as Greek-speaking pharaohs, building temples in traditional forms while governing a multicultural kingdom. Their queens and kings bore Egyptian titles, honored Egyptian gods, and yet belonged to a Hellenistic world of dynastic marriages, court intrigue, naval wars, and Mediterranean politics. The last great figure in the pharaonic story is Cleopatra VII. Though she was not a pharaoh in the Old Kingdom or New Kingdom sense, she was a ruler of Egypt who understood performance, language, diplomacy, and sacred image as sharply as any ancient king. Descendant of Ptolemy the First, the Macedonian general who took Egypt after Alexander, Cleopatra inherited a kingdom pressured by Rome, torn by family rivalry, burdened by debt and dependence, yet still wealthy, fertile, and symbolically powerful. She learned the Egyptian language, associated herself with Isis, appeared in temple reliefs with traditional royal forms, and sought to preserve Egypt's independence through alliance first with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony. Her story has been wrapped in legend, romance, propaganda, and hostile Roman storytelling. But beneath those layers stands a capable monarch facing an almost impossible geopolitical situation. Rome was no longer merely another foreign power. It was the coming shape of the Mediterranean world. Relentless, militarized, ambitious, and skilled at turning alliances into control. Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar produced a son, Caesarion, presented in Egypt as Ptolemy 15, and with Antony, she built a partnership that challenged Octavian, the future Augustus. But after the defeat at Actium in 31 BCE, the end came quickly. Antony died, Cleopatra died by suicide in 30 BCE, and Egypt became a Roman province, no longer an independent kingdom. No longer ruled by pharaohs in the old living sense, Caesarion was killed, and the last dynastic hope vanished. Yet even under Rome, temples continued to be decorated in Egyptian style. Emperors appeared as pharaohs on temple walls, priests maintained rituals, and ordinary Egyptians kept older traditions alive in changing forms. This is one of the great truths of Egypt. Political endings did not instantly erase cultural memory. The pharaoh as world ruler had fallen, but the gods still received offerings. The Nile still flooded. Children still learned names. Families still buried their dead with care. And the stones still held images of kings whose states had vanished centuries before. When we speak of the rise and fall of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, we are not speaking of a single arc from glory to ruin. We are speaking of many sunrises and many sunsets. Narmer uniting, Djoser ascending in steps, Sneferu perfecting stone, Khufu reaching impossible scale, Pepi II presiding over fading central power, Mentuhotep restoring unity, Senusret III hardening the frontier, Ahmose driving out rivals and opening empire, Hatshepsut making kingship bloom in an unexpected form, Thutmose III pushing Egypt to military height, Amenhotep III bathing kingship in gold, Akhenaten burning too brightly in religious revolution, Tutankhamun becoming immortal through a small tomb, Seti I restoring elegance, Ramesses II, Sigu turning kingship into colossal memory, Ramesses III holding back the storm, Paye bringing pharaohship back from the south, the Satas reviving old forms in a new world, Nectanebo II carrying the last native crown, and Cleopatra fighting to keep Egypt sovereign beneath Rome's shadow. To understand their rise, we must understand that Egypt's greatness came from harmony between geography, belief, labor, and time. The Nile created a dependable agricultural base. Deserts protected and defined the land. Stone offered permanence, writing preserved names. And religion gave political order a cosmic meaning. A pharaoh who built a temple was not merely decorating his reign. He was feeding the gods, renewing creation, and displaying that the world still held together. A pharaoh who fought enemies was not merely expanding borders. He was smiting chaos, the same chaos represented in art by bound captives. Desert creatures, foreign lands, storms, and disorder beyond the Green Valley. A pharaoh who celebrated a jubilee was not merely marking years. He was ritually rejuvenating his power so Egypt could continue to breathe. But these same strengths could become burdens, because monuments required labor and wealth. Temples accumulated land and influence. Ideology could hide practical weakness, and the memory of past greatness could pressure later rulers into imitation without renewal. The Pyramid Age could not continue forever. The empire could not expand forever. The priesthoods could not be enriched forever without challenging the throne. The old gods could not be ignored without social shock. And foreign powers could not be kept forever beyond the horizon. Every great pharaoh ruled inside a balance that was easier to praise than to maintain. This is why Egypt's history feels both monumental and tender. Its kings seem enormous, yet their greatness depended on harvests. Scribes, quarrymen, soldiers, boat crews, singers, embalmers, washermen, bakers, mothers, and children. The pyramid was royal, but it was made by many hands. The temple belonged to a god, but its incense was prepared by ordinary labor. The army marched under the pharaoh's name, but each soldier carried his own thirst, fear, and longing. And when the state weakened, the experience was not abstract. It was delayed grain, insecure roads, unpaid workers, robbed tombs, contested offices, anxious letters, and families wondering whether the old order still protected them. In sleep, it may help to see the pharaohs not as statues only, but as figures moving through rooms, Khufu perhaps listening to reports of stone and labor, Hatshepsut watching incense trees arrive from Punt, Thutmose III studying roads before Megiddo, Amenhotep III receiving foreign envoys in a palace painted with marsh scenes, Akhenaten standing in the white glare of Amarna. Tutankhamun carried through ceremonies he was too young to fully command. Ramesses II hearing his own victory poems recited, Ramesses III walking through Medinet Habu while danger gathers quietly inside the palace. Cleopatra looking from Alexandria toward a sea controlled by Rome. The art of pharaohship was the art of making life appear eternal, and Egyptian artists helped create that illusion with extraordinary discipline. The king's body was shown ideal, balanced, recognizable through symbols rather than passing moods. Crowns spoke identity. The white crown of Upper Egypt, the red crown of Lower Egypt, the double crown of union, the blue war crown, the Neem's headcloth, the false beard, the crook and flail, the uraeus cobra ready to strike, the bull tail, the cartouche encircling the royal name. Every element told the viewer that this was not simply a man, but the office through which order entered the world. Yet in certain periods the mask slips slightly, and we glimpse a more human kingship. Senusret III's lined face, Akhenaten's unusual body, Tutankhamun's delicate burial goods, Ramesses II's aged mummy, Cleopatra's political desperation. These traces remind us that divine kings still had bones, illnesses, families, disappointments, and deaths. Royal women also shaped the pharaonic story in ways that older histories often minimized. Queens, mothers, wives, daughters, priestesses, and regents carried legitimacy, mediated succession, endowed temples, and sometimes ruled directly. Mernith in the early dynastic period may have held extraordinary authority. Sobekneferu closed the 12th dynasty as a female ruler. Hatshepsut became king in full ceremonial form. Tiye influenced diplomacy and royal ideology. Nefertiti stood at the center of Amarna's visual theology and may have held power near its end. Nefertari was honored with a temple and a splendid tomb. Tausret ruled near the end of the 19th dynasty, and Cleopatra became the last active monarch of an independent Egypt. The greatness of pharaohs was never produced by men alone. Dynastic power moved through households, marriages, wombs, rituals, and alliances. And the palace was as political as the battlefield. Succession was one of the constant dangers, because the divine office had to pass through human families, and human families are rarely simple. Sons died, brothers competed, queens promoted children, officials chose sides, generals rose, priests negotiated, and sometimes a dynasty ended, not with invasion, but with uncertainty inside the royal house. The Egyptian solution was always to present the successful heir as inevitable, chosen by gods from the beginning, but the very need to say this tells us how fragile succession could be. When a king was strong, his monuments made legitimacy look effortless. When a king was weak, inscriptions worked harder. And when the line broke, later rulers edited the past, erasing names, rewriting descent, and burying embarrassment beneath ceremony. The landscapes of the pharaohs also shaped their memory. Memphis in the north, near the meeting point of valley and delta, was the old administrative heart, close to Saqqara, Dashur, and Giza, where early kings built tombs that turned desert edges into royal horizons. Thebes in the south became the spiritual capital of the new kingdom, with Karnak and Luxor on the east bank for the living gods, and the Valley of the Kings, Dir el-Bahri, Medinet Habu, the Ramesseum, and noble tombs on the west bank, where the sun set into death and renewal. Amarna rose suddenly in Middle Egypt, like a royal vision drawn across empty land, then was abandoned, its broken houses and tombs preserving the remains of a revolution that could not outlive its founder. High Ramesses in the delta glittered under Ramesses II through Fi, too, close to routes into Asia, a capital of chariots, palaces, canals, and military readiness. Later, Sais carried the hopes of revival. Alexandria opened Egypt to the Mediterranean in a new way. Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, Roman, and many other worlds meeting by the sea, each city tells us what kind of pharaohship mattered in its age. Pyramid kings looked to the desert edge near Memphis. Imperial kings looked from Thebes to Nubia and Asia. Ramesside kings strengthened the delta frontier. Site kings negotiated with Mediterranean powers. Ptolemaic rulers governed from a cosmopolitan port while still carving themselves onto ancient temple walls. And through all these changes, the Nile remained the quiet spine, carrying grain, stone, statues, soldiers, taxes, letters, and festival boats. Egyptian history can seem obsessed with death because tombs survive so well, but it was equally obsessed with renewal. Fields renewed after flood, kings renewed through jubilees, gods renewed through daily temple rituals, the sun renewed after night, the dead renewed through offerings and names. Even decline was often answered by restoration. When the Old Kingdom fell, the Middle Kingdom restored unity. When Hyksos' power divided the land, Ahmose restored and expanded it. When Amarna disrupted religion, Horemheb and the Ramessides restored orthodoxy. When Libyan and Nubian rulers took power, they used Egyptian forms to restore legitimacy. When foreign kings ruled, they too wore pharaonic imagery. Egypt's genius was not only endurance, it was the ability to absorb disruption into older patterns, to make new rulers speak an ancient language, to persuade even conquerors that the crown of Egypt required Egyptian gestures. Yet endurance is not the same as changelessness. And one of the most calming truths for a sleep documentary is that even the most imposing civilization moved slowly through transformation, not in a straight line, not in a simple fall from purity into weakness, but in waves, old forms returning with new meanings, gods rising and fading in importance, capitals shifting, art styles changing, military tools evolving, foreign peoples becoming Egyptian, Egyptian culture influencing neighbors, borders opening and closing. The pharaoh's story is therefore not a staircase upward and then downward. It is more like the Nile itself, swelling, spreading, withdrawing, leaving traces, sometimes generous, sometimes dangerous, always moving. The earliest kings could not have imagined Cleopatra bargaining with Rome, and Cleopatra could not have walked through Khufu's pyramid without feeling the immeasurable age behind her. Ramesses II was already ancient to later Egyptians, yet he lived long after the pyramid builders. When the Greeks visited Egypt, they saw a land of terrifying antiquity. Priests who claimed memories older than Greek cities, monuments whose builders were already legends, animals honored in temples, scripts that seemed magical, and statues half buried in sand. Egypt became for outsiders a place where time itself behaved differently. But for Egyptians, time was not merely distance, it was ritual continuity. as long as offerings were made, names spoken, festivals performed, and temples maintained, the past remained active. This is why damnatio memoriae, the destruction or removal of names, mattered so much. To erase a name was to attack eternity. Akhenaten's name suffered this. Hatshepsut's image suffered this in places. Many lesser figures vanished because their inscriptions were damaged, usurped or forgotten. But ironically, attempts at erasure often reveal importance, because ordinary names are not attacked so carefully. Those who threatened the official story left scars in stone. And scars are also evidence. The rise of a pharaoh required naming. The fall often involved renaming, and the rediscovery required reading names again after centuries of silence. When hieroglyphs could no longer be understood, Egypt's kings became images without voices, their walls beautiful but mute. Then the decipherment of hieroglyphs reopened the archive, and pharaohs who had slept in signs began to speak through royal lists, stelae, tomb biographies, letters, hymns, accounts, and temple reliefs. Their voices are still formal, partial, propagandistic, and distant, but not silent. If we walk gently through the gallery of the greatest pharaohs one final time, we can notice how each represents a different answer to the question of power. Narmer answers with union. He is the beginning of the two lands as a single sacred body. Djoser answers with transformation, turning tomb architecture into a stairway of stone. Sneferu answers with experiment and perfection, showing that greatness often requires trial before grace. Khufu answers with scale, the ability of a state to make the impossible visible. Khafre answers with royal presence, the king as sphinx, like guardian of horizon and necropolis. Menkaure answers with proportion, reminding us that smaller can still be eternal. Hatshepsut answers with duration and warning, showing that long rule without renewing strength may become twilight. Mentuhotep II Tsururu answers with reunification. The healing of a divided land. Senusret III answers with discipline, frontier vigilance, and the burdened face of kingship. Amenemhat III answers with prosperity managed through water, mines, and administration. Ahmose answers with liberation and expansion, turning vulnerability into empire. Hatshepsut answers with sacred legitimacy crafted through art, temple, and divine story. Thutmose III answers with strategy, conquest, and imperial structure. Amenhotep III answers with splendor, diplomacy, and solar majesty. Akhenaten answers with radical vision, beautiful and destabilizing. Tutankhamun answers with restoration and the accidental immortality of discovery. Horemheb answers with correction, law, and the closing of a troubled chapter. Seti I answers with elegance and disciplined restoration. Ramesses II answers with image, longevity, and political theater on a colossal scale. Merneptah answers with defense in an unsettled world. Ramesses III answers with survival against storm and the pain of internal decay. Paye answers with devotion from the south, proving that Egyptian kingship could be reborn through Nubian hands. Samtik-I answers with reunification under foreign pressure. Amasis answers with prosperity in a connected Mediterranean age. Nectanebo II answers with the last native resistance. And Cleopatra answers with intelligence at the edge of imperial inevitability. None of them ruled alone. None controlled the future as fully as inscriptions claimed. And none escaped the final quiet. But each left a shape in history. And together they form a procession longer than any temple wall, moving from mace and pallet to pyramid. From pyramid to hidden tomb. From hidden tomb to colossal temple. From temple to foreign court. From native crown to Roman province. The sleep of ancient Egypt is never empty. It is filled with slow sounds. A reed boat touching a bank at dawn. A scribe smoothing papyrus with careful fingers. A stonecutter tapping a chisel in steady rhythm. A priest opening the shrine doors before sunrise. A queen's jewelry whispering as she walks through painted halls, cattle lowing near flooded fields, soldiers tightening chariot harness, children watching a festival boat pass with music and incense, workers in a tomb village waiting for grain rations, foreign envoys climbing palace steps with gifts, mourners carrying offerings to a chapel, and somewhere beyond them all, a pharaoh's name being spoken so that he may live again. These are the human sounds beneath the grandeur, the sounds that keep the story from becoming only stone. Because the rise and fall of pharaohs was felt in kitchens, fields, workshops, barracks, temples, harbors, and tombs, a strong king might mean secure roads, full granaries, busy workshops, and festivals bright with offerings. A weak king might mean unpaid labor, local conflict, anxious officials, and rumors from borders. Yet most people lived between these extremes. Inside the ordinary patience of the Nile year, sowing, harvesting, repairing, praying, marrying, grieving, and sleeping under the same stars that looked down on kings. This is why Egypt's history is so fitting for the edge of sleep. It is vast enough to carry the mind away, but rhythmic enough to soothe it, rise, flood, planting, harvest, rain, jubilee, burial, restoration, decline, and rise again. The pharaohs wanted eternity, but what they truly achieved was memory. Not unbroken, not complete, but resilient. Memory in stone, memory in names, memory in gold, memory in ruined temples where the sun still touches carved faces, memory in stories told at night, when the present grows quiet. And the past comes near without demanding anything from us. So now imagine the Nile under moonlight, wide and dark, reflecting stars that ancient priests once measured with sacred attention. The fields are still, the desert cliffs are pale, and the temples stand like sleeping ships anchored between earth and sky. At Saqqara, the step pyramid rests in silence, its tears no longer new but still rising. At Giza, the great pyramids hold the horizon with patient weight. At Deir el-Bahri, the terraces of Hatshepsut's temple blend into the mountain. At Karnak, columns stand like a forest made for gods. At Amarna, the broken city lies open to wind and memory. At the Valley of the Kings, painted corridors descend into the hidden west. At Abu Simbel, the seated Ramesses watches a river landscape changed by modern hands, yet still charged with ancient intention. At Medinet Habu, Ramesses III's victories remain carved, though the world he defended has gone. At Napata and Meroe, the pyramids of Kush answer Egypt from the south. At Sais, little remains, but the idea of revival. At Alexandria, the sea keeps washing the edge of Cleopatra's vanished palace. All these places are chapters in one long-breathing story. The pharaohs rose because Egypt learned to bind nature, labor, and divinity into a single royal vision. They fell because no vision, however sacred, can freeze the movement of history. Floods vary, families fail, enemies adapt, priests grow powerful, workers hunger, trade shifts. Bronze gives way to iron, old gods meet new gods, and distant empires arrive with their own dreams of command. Yet the fall did not make the rise meaningless, just as sunset does not cancel the morning. The greatness of ancient Egypt lies partly in the fact that it knew everything must be renewed. Every day the sun had to be reborn. Every year the flood had to return. Every rain had to prove itself. Every dead king needed offerings. Every temple needed care. Permanence was not passive. It required endless attention, and perhaps that is the gentlest lesson the pharaohs leave behind. Even stone survives because someone once cared enough to lift it, carve it, name it, and place it beneath the sky. Now the night deepens. The river moves in darkness. The crowns are set aside. The chariots are still. The scribes have dried their brushes. The incense has faded from the sanctuary. And the greatest pharaohs of ancient Egypt rest again where history keeps them, not alive as they wished, not gone as time intended, but somewhere in between, held in the long, soft memory of the world.